Just opened this book this morning, which is basically about the botanical history of Cook's first voyage, with Joseph Banks on board, botanising, obviously in Australia, and all the other countries and islands that they visited on their journey with the Endeavour. Banks had previously done a trip to Labrador and in Canada and a couple of other places on that first voyage before coming on the Endeavour with James Cook, and subsequently botanised much of the east coast of Australia. I mean, it was only just the beginning, and there was a lot more botanising to be done beyond that initial visit. But it is a precursor to much of what the botanists of the world discovered about Australian botany, and obviously other countries on his journeys. Banks obviously got his name written up in lights for many of his discoveries and the wild diversity of plants that had previously not been recorded in the West. But I think we need to be mindful of the fact that many Indigenous people have used plants for a millennium as herbal, medicinal, spiritual, cultural connectors, ethnobotanical connectors of their culture and their language, their food and their medicine and so forth. So I think we always should be careful when we talk about a person or persons that may have just been written up and as having discovered something. I think often things were discovered long before that person got written up in lights, and because that person had a greater access to media and being promoted beyond where that thing that was found in what was previously a foreign land to those people, doesn't mean it was foreign to the people that lived there. So I'm always conscious of being inclusive and putting the context of all the ethnobotanical connections of these plants, because it weaves a much more interesting story, and it's also closer to the truth, because sometimes the local people have got and I've found this with all the thousands of blogs I've done online. Whenever I write up something that I've read about, and then subsequently written a blog on, sometimes you realise, or often actually, you realise you're missing parts of the puzzle about the story of that plant or the fauna of that area or the culture of that area from the local perspective. My wife being from Borneo in Malaysian Sabah, part of Borneo Island, which is one of the states of Malaysia, obviously, after the Second World War that was created. So Malaysia, although it includes parts of Borneo, prior to the Second World War, Sabah and Sarawak in Borneo in Malaysia, what had become Malaysia, were not part of Malaysia at all. They were totally separate in who ruled them. So we have to be very conscious of the Indigenous people, which my wife is one, and how that connects back to history, to the fauna and flora, the foods, the culture, and the continuum of where we are now today, which is all true if put in the right and full context. But I don't think we can separate out parts of history or parts of the truth and represent that as inclusive of all the facts and all the information. I think there's an amazing collection of plants. Getting back to Banks, the amount of plants that he identified and wrote up was quite ahead of its time, and when he went on that journey with Captain Cook, he took some famous manuscripts and books from Carl Linnaeus and other famous not only plant experts or botanists, but also information and books from the natural world that related to the time. So not only was it a historical perspective of information that was available at the time, which was somewhat limited compared to today, it was also, it just puts a context to what was known then in science and in natural journals and scientific manuscripts. And then you reflect on that back to where we are today with plant DNA screening. We can obviously get more accurate sense of what things are and what they're related to, and that's why we're going through at the moment a massive change in plant nomenclature. We're getting a lot of renaming of plants because when we have the science to back it up, we can get far more accurate with that information. But science being science, in 100 years' time or 50 years' time or 20 years' time or 1 year's time, you never know. More information comes to light and we might be changing again on some tact. So I think we have to keep a very open mind about the natural world, and I think it's imperative that we pass on this information, make sure that people are aware of the diversity with knowledge of climate change and the impacts of that. Climate's obviously been changing forever. It's not a new thing, and science is telling us that man-made climate change is adding to what we already knew about climate change. So that there's forever changing perspectives, and we must be aware and not blindsided by people that have got an agenda that is either financial or political or for self-interest. We have to try to look at a bigger perspective of the world and hopefully get a clearer insight into where we're all heading as inhabitants of the earth. I would recommend this Joseph Banks Flora Legend to anyone if they can access that in their library. It's a wonderful book. It's very heavy reading and there's a lot of information, but it does give a great Australian perspective and a historical perspective of plants first discovered by this English botanist. There's obviously I've got a lot of books and I'm reading all the time, and it's hard sometimes to put everything into perspective. When I do on my blogs, I find I'm reading about, as you can see with these other books here, I read about the Antarctic journeys, I read about Sabah and Sarawak in Malaysia a lot, and the rest of Borneo, which is Kalimantan, and Brunei. I read about the history, I read about the wildlife, I read about the plants, the animals, the culture, the ethnobotanical connections. I think I've got this book picked out here that I'm forever got my nose in, one of many. Wade Davis, he's a Canadian ethnobotanist, and he's got an amazing ability to tell the story of ethnobotanical connections between people, plants, animals, cultures, plants that have got medicinal, herbal, and also psychotropic even influences that the shamans of certain countries used. And I think all Indigenous people at some time used an element of this in telling the story, or without the access to our modern perspectives of science. They were the wise men of the village, and they would interpret all the natural world around us, and sometimes they were very accurate in forecasting some of the science that came later, but in some cases it seems a bit wild that anyone would believe anything at that time the way they did, but I think we've got to put that into the perspective of some of the current media and the way it's written up. I think we would have to question some of the accuracy of what's written before our eyes. So I think it's a wonderful thing to read a range of these books, because I think it can give you historical perspective. I think we need historical perspective. I think we need scientific perspective on our natural world. And I think we need to connect all these things with ethnobotanical perspectives, because it gives us a much wider breadth of knowledge of the natural world and our human footprint and our human connection to nature, the natural world, the stars, the oceans, and the land, and the plants and animals that live there, and all the other little creatures that perhaps don't get a Guernsey because they're small, seemingly insignificant, but make up the full breadth of biodiversity and what makes a balanced ecosystem in the world. So some really interesting books here. I'd recommend for anyone that's got a curious mind, Joseph Banks' Flora Legion, wonderfully written, great authors. Wade Davis for all your ethnobotanical stuff. There's other people that write about that sort of stuff. David Suzuki obviously is I haven't got one of his books right here at the minute, but another great perspective on the obviously the natural world, and his interest in conservation is legendary. You've got books here on wild Sabah in Borneo in Malaysia. You've got Maluku Basin, which many people would never have heard of, but that's also in Sabah in Borneo. I'm yet to go there. I've been to many of the places in my 18 or so trips to Borneo, but I haven't been to Maluku Basin, but I know many people that have. They've got some massive agathis forests there in basically a hidden valley surrounded by mountains with a river that runs through the exit of that mountain range, just a narrow valley that comes out one end, and quite a mysterious place with a lot of, and like a lot of these places that if you read the historical perspectives, hornbills and things like these amazing almost prehistoric looking birds that still exist in Borneo today were apparently in the thousands in the flocks that the early Western travellers saw and documented. And we can only imagine what the local people saw before these places became compromised as oil palm and other things sort of took over the landscape with development and forestry and so forth. Obviously, the Shackleton voyages, Captain Scott, and there's a whole lot of other people that went to Antarctica. I always find that fascinating, the human endurance, but it also reminds me when I'm studying my plants that actually a lot of plants existed there at certain times over history, a very long time ago obviously, and these plants connected our Gondwana connections between Australia, New Guinea, New Caledonia, New Zealand, and also South Africa, and then of course the connection from South America, Chile and Argentina. So this Terra del Fuego. So amazing connections can be made through learning about nature, about not only plants. I mean, that's my main field of interest, but I'm also interested in animals as well, and anything to do with the natural world and how it connects. And I think it's that connection that makes the story and the interest far more rich for me. And I would recommend people open their mind and read some of these things. There's Kashgar. There's a book on the old China's old Silk Road, which I've travelled partly on in Yunnan in Western China, which connects with Burma, or what is now known as Myanmar. But Kashgar is right on the far western side of China and connects to the western, further west of Asia into Middle East and then Europe. Of course, it's that big connecting loop of trade that's gone on for a very, very long time, and it's got historical perspectives. But of course, the more you read about plants, you'll realise that people have been moving seeds and plants for mostly food, of course, and for medicines medicinal purposes, and also for trading herbs and spices and so forth. You get back to Sabah and Malaysia and Indonesia, and you get the Spice Islands of Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and that has a massive connection for all the plants that came out of Asia that went into Europe and the UK and were highly treasured, and the amount of voyages that connected those plants and herbs back to the food and cuisine of faraway lands than what they were originally endemic to. You can go to South America and you can look at all your potato, and Central America you've got potatoes and corn and tomatoes and many of the different plants that, once again, chilies is a very good example. It's almost universal. It's basically used in almost all cuisine around the world, but of course a lot of the places that have adopted it would consider chili a strong part of their cuisine, but of course it's not native to a lot of the places. It's not native to Asia, it's not native to Europe, it's not native to Australia. It's native to Central and South America. So a lot of these plants become universal, and then of course as time goes by, in the full breadth and length of time, people from other cultures adopt these plants and use them for whatever purposes, mostly food, but sometimes for medicines and so forth. And we realise that we start to question what is native and what is indigenous, and sometimes the language around these terms gets blurred because we realise that we've been using something a very long time, and we often in ignorance think it's ours. It always was here, and of course it's just a passage of time, and originally a lot of these things were from some other place. Doesn't matter if it was tribal groups of people that have immigrated and moved over millennia, or like our First Nation people. You know, they were here a long way, I think 65,000+ years, I believe, before white people came to Australia from Europe and UK, England. But I think you'll find that all people all around the world have been moving at some point in search of food, or conquering new lands, or just moving with climate. And I think all these things make an interesting conversation and a great collection of knowledge to show our kids and our grandkids. And I would recommend some of these, or any of the books I'm showing here, but I mean this is only just a tiny little snippet of books that I find a rich source of information, and I think it's good for the heart and soul to read these things, because they tell and bind a story not only of we tend to look at things from our humanity, but we also need to look at things from the extended natural world, and what we are doing and how we interpret all that, and what our direction is with conserving some of these amazing things, but also acknowledging that change is inevitable as well. So there's some huge perspectives. I'm not pretending to have the answers. I'm just exposing some of the things I'm reading about, and why I get so passionate about the natural world, and more especially with plants and botany, because it's given me an amazing life and amazing perspective of things. I thank my father for that, introducing me to this from a very early age. And I've got 2 grandchildren, and I'm always trying to engage them about nature on a basic childlike level, but also just sharing these connections on some level, just slowly but surely, so that they get a bit better perspective of the world and how it connects from one place to another, and how we all connect from one place to another.